Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Now, trust in public bodies is declining, but I don't need to tell you that because there are plenty of examples of politicians who lie to us and don't do what they say they're going to do, corruption scandals, or even public services that just don't work the way we expect, particularly when we're paying lots of tax and not getting the level of service we rightly deserve. Something feels broken, and I've got a feeling it's a little bit to do with trust. But what exactly is trust? Why is it eroding? And crucially, what can we do about it? My guest on this episode is Libby Maman, a researcher, academic, and founder of a firm that helps organisations measure and build trust. Libby's work sits at the intersection of data, democracy, and design. And she spent years developing practical ways for governments, regulators, and companies to turn the kind of stated values that they love throwing out there, things like transparency, accountability, participation, and inclusiveness, into measurable indicators, and then use those to make meaningful changes. In other words, how can you measure that you're doing what you're saying you're doing? In the episode, we explore why trust is more than just a gut feeling, how measurement can drive behaviour, and why fixing trust doesn't begin with PR, but with action. Libby also explains why some values are harder to measure than others, and what it means to co-design metrics with the people who are impacted, as well as how gamifying progress can actually build institutional change. It's a really timely and thoughtful conversation, and it'll give you a new lens on how trust is built, broken, and can be rebuilt. So without further ado, it's my discussion with Libby Maman on measuring and rebuilding trust. Libby, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Nice to be here.
I'm so thrilled that you could join me because I know we're going to have a fascinating conversation. Obviously, I know who you are, but for my listeners that haven't come across you, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I'm Libby Maman. I'm a researcher and academic, but also a founder and CEO of Luminata, a firm that helps organizations measure and build trust. My background is in public policy and in social science, and I worked both inside the government and in academic, but recently I'm focusing on consulting.
Amazing. I love that. And so you mentioned the word trust. And I think that obviously it's a small word, right? But lots of meaning. How do you get interested in the idea of trust?
Yeah, well, I like the question. I think it started when I was really young. I grew up in an amazing artistic community, spiritual leaders, thinkers, but they were really distrustful of systems, of institutions, and quite excluded, and they weren't engaged politically. And I don't know, I just always remember that troubled me. I felt like I loved the values I got there, and I wanted them to feel more connected to society and not exclude themselves. And I just felt I want to understand why is there such distrust in institutions, and how can that be fixed? How can institutions become more democratic in the sense that they allow for different types of communities to be part of it?
And it is really interesting at the moment because we can see lots of examples of where people have lost, I would use the word faith, but I think it means trust in these establishments, these processes in government. And so you get lots of people voting for extreme parties, you get people who don't vote at all. There's clearly dissatisfaction, and that's across the world. We can see this. And so I think this is a really interesting subject.
Yeah. Trust has been a central topic and many people are concerned about it. I feel, though, that the solutions aren't so clear. So while many people recognize now that there is an issue of distrust and declining trust, by the way, not only in institutions, also in each other, social trust, the research I'm currently doing, what we found, it's not published yet, is that social trust is actually much lower than trust in institutions. So really, this is a larger problem. But the focus is more on looking at that problem and not much in looking into solutions. How can that trust be repaired, especially in institutions and in governments?
And to take me back to your early research, so you looked at governmental performance. How did you come into looking at that? And then tell us what you discovered in your research.
Yeah. So at first, I decided to work in the government. I felt that the way to fix the system is to work in the system. So I worked in Israel in the ministry. I was an advisor to the Director General. which was a really interesting job. It was actually an intermediate in between the professional, the civil servants, and the political elected officials. So it was right in the middle, and really exposed to me the tension between these two levels, but also the issue of who should make decisions. So on the one hand, civil servants go to work in public sector, myself included, to make change, to improve the system. But on the other hand, they're being attacked and criticized by the public by having too much power. So if you heard of these discussions on technocratic government and who chose them, who elected them. On the other hand, there's equally distrust in politicians, and in between, like these two groups also distrust each other. And I just felt there isn't a clear guide, a clear way forward. How should civil servants behave? How should ministries, how should the public administration in general, how should it behave in a way that would be both democratic and legitimate, but also increase trust? And I knew that being efficient and delivering, right, and changing the system, improving it, is also part of that trust. So how does it juggle between these different demands? So I decided to leave the civil service and to write a PhD on that topic and to try and find an answer. And the answer I found was through developing indicators, measurement for what I call the democratic qualities of the public administration. So first, I'll say the reason I focused on measurement and on data is because I saw that eventually there's data, and quantitative data draws a lot of attention. So maybe this builds on a human heuristic, but when there is a data, when there is a number, attention goes there, and that leads to changes. And I saw that in other measures like ease of doing business, these measures, even though there are lots of criticism on their quality, which I agree, and they reduce complexity, it's true. But still, once you have a measure, it draws attention and it changes policy and affects policy. So I thought, why not just use that? That's a fact. That's how things work, and create a better measure, a measure of what really matters, which are these democratic qualities. So once I decided that, my first goal was to understand what are those values? What are we expecting from public administrations? What do we expect from them democratically, socially? And then I focused on 4 qualities, on transparency, participation, accountability, and inclusiveness. And I developed these measures. I did research on that. I collected data on European regulators, and I also worked with civil society. I quite quickly also went into consulting because I really wanted to apply this idea or this method of developing quantitative measures to values and ideals. I wanted it to be used and implemented. So I worked with civil society to develop measures of different public organizations in the local level, municipalities, also international level, and to get data for those values. So if, for example, if we want our government to be innovative, so we need to have indicators that not only will measure the level that it is innovative now, but also would guide them into knowing how can they improve and become more innovative. Just having the data, having those measures creates a change. It really leads organizations to improve in the things that you measure.
So you've tapped into the logic that says here there are dynamics that we want to occur, and we can argue about what those are, right? But innovation is a good example. We don't want the government to just kind of keep doing what it's always done, because we know that doesn't need to grow. So we want them to be innovative. We don't want them to be too innovative, right? Because they're not disruptors, but we need them to sort of move. And so you're basically saying, okay, this is the classic thing, right? We need to measure things so that we can hold them to account and people know what they need to do. The trouble is, I guess, that when we talk about something like being innovative, that's a really loose term, right? It means different things to different people. So I'm struck by 2 challenges. One is, where do you get the data from in the first place that demonstrates this? And then 2, how do you set the objectives around that, recognizing that we're taking something that's a kind of gray, it's almost qualitative, and we're trying to transform it into quantitative. So how do we think about that in terms of identifying the data and then sort of setting targets around it?
Yeah. So first of all, I really love it when people say that. That's like the most common response I get, is that either it's impossible to measure these things. How do you do it? Where do you start from? That really gets me interested, and that's I think that's what really motivated me to get into this field in particular. So it is definitely possible. And I just develop a framework to do it, a method, let's call it. That's how I work with my clients, with the organization. And so my answer to your question is both in the method, which I'll detail, and in the strategy. So first, the most important is that I do it I lead co-design process. What does that mean? That means that I invite the relevant stakeholders to define the concept itself. So, right, the first step of developing the measure is to first have a clear definition of what it is we're trying to achieve. So, if we're talking about transparency, we need to define what does that mean, or innovation, what does that mean? And there are different possible definitions. And the only definition that matters is the definition that the relevant stakeholders agree with. And I always say this is the most important step, is the first step of defining our the borders, right? What it is we want to measure. And by having the relevant stakeholders be part of this process, we make sure that later on the measures are acceptable by them and used, and then the data also is used. Then the second answer is more technical. When we're dealing with complex and you said qualitative, I don't really like to use that word, but let's say qualitative concepts, one indicator is not enough, and we need more. We need several indicators. We need to combine different types of them. So sometimes we need to combine objective data with subjective data. So asking people how they perceive. So for example, if it's innovation, if we're looking at innovative processes, so we can define several processes or designs that we know from research that create innovation, but we can also look at the results, and we can also integrate the people's perspectives on the level of innovation. And I believe that having various types of indicators reflects the complexity of reality, right? If you have complex indicators, it reflects better the complexity of reality. And how do you get data for that? A lot of time we need to create the data. So these are processes that take time. For example, now I'm leading a project in Israel with the Israeli Democracy Institution. We're developing the first ever measurements of governmental quality with 20 values, 20 ideals. And we led a whole project with different stakeholders from civil society, from the government, to agree on what those concepts are. And now we have indicators, but we don't have data. So yes, this is definitely a challenge, but we're creating the data. We're working with the measured organizations to create the necessary data, or running surveys to complement it. So it takes time to create this infrastructure, but in the long term, this will allow for, so it's harder in the beginning. We need to create lots of data, but then once we have the system working, once we have the sources coming in, then measurement will become easier. And then I also believe that the value of measurement will be higher the more you measure, right? The consistent measurement, what it can also provide you insights on changes, improvements, etc.
So if I looked at innovation, I get completely that that's not something governments historically wouldn't have benchmarked themselves on that. The reason we're interested in it is we often feel that governments are not innovative, right? So it's clearly not something that's been on the radar necessarily. But what would be an example of a metric that you could use, or data that you would use for measuring how innovative people are?
Yeah. So for example, in this project, one of the indicators we have is whether each ministry, we're measuring the ministries in Israel and comparing them. So we're whether each one of them has an officer, a director in charge of innovation. Another indicator is whether there is budget dedicated for innovative solutions. So this is more in the input level of how much is the organization dedicating for innovation. Those are two indicators. Other indicators, like I mentioned, are perspectives of the workers. So employees, how much do they perceive their organization encouraging them to be innovative in their work? So these are just some examples.
So you're really, the reason I asked that question is it struck me that the innovation, like as you were talking about, my mind goes to each time you mention one of those, I'm like, well, how could you game that? Right. Okay. So it's really easy to appoint someone, go, you're head of innovation, and you give them no influence whatsoever. So that's just one thing, right? So you'd say, okay, if you don't, so I guess your point is, if you don't even have someone that's responsible for innovation, then there's a low likelihood of it happening, right? So that you would sort of say, I guess, is necessary but not sufficient, right? It says necessary, but it's not going to solve the problem. So you then go, okay, have they got a budget for innovation? Now, again, I could fudge that and say, well, we have a big budget for innovation, but but we spend it on something else, right? But we've officially call it innovation, but it's not innovation at all. We're pretending. So in other words, I guess what you're doing implicitly is you're not saying any one of these things is on its own going to tell the story. We need a rich tapestry of these things, recognizing that, of course, we're dealing with humans. And and innovation, I think, is interesting because humans feel under threat. Right? Innovation typically means people lose jobs, right? It is how it's often perceived. Or we're going to have to change things around here, and that scares me. So there's a lot of vested interest in not being innovative and keeping going what you're doing, right? For job preservation, for laziness, whatever. And so you're saying we build this patchwork of things that will give us some kind of proxy. And so what I like about, I think what you're describing is to say, this isn't about pinning it on one thing. This is about a tapestry of different things. Each one individually is gameable, I guess, to an extent. But if you have it's going to be quite hard to game the entire tapestry. In other words, you've got enough data points to sort of go, if you really want to game this, it's going to be quite hard. Is that the way to look at it?
Yeah, and you will be surprised how things that you think that are pretty obvious and basic, like even having someone dealing with it, are not so obvious for governments and for public organizations. And many times that basic level isn't even there. So we really want to run towards the end goal, right? Measuring the outcomes and the results, but really we're working with organizations that are still quite behind. And just having that as an indicator already creates a change. It already encourages them to even dedicate resources to encourage innovation. And then again, something I always say when I work with organizations, especially with civil society, that actually is an actor outside of government trying to improve it from the outside. So what I always say is that we want to have indicators that are aspirational, that we know that the organizations we're measured are gonna score very low on them. But we want to have some of these kinds of indicators in our measures because the goal of the measures are also to make a change, right? We want to set the bar high. We want to include indicators that we know now are not going to be, the organization's not going to perform very well on now. But I think that when we work with data, we need to look into the future, right? And the objectives, where do we want this organization to be in the future? And so navigate these two types of data.
So this is a really interesting thing, right? So we're almost into gamification here. So I talked about you can game metrics, but you talked about some things that are basic, right, to do, which is kind of like appoint someone as head of innovation, right? You can do that very quickly if you wanted to, right? But then there's things that you're saying, we're going to make this a little bit harder and a little bit more challenging. And so I guess what you're thinking about here implicitly as you look at these different metrics is to say, this is not about something where people can immediately score full marks because that's kind of pointless, right? So it needs to be aspirational, but equally you want some things in there that are easy for them to do, because if every single metric you had was impossible, right, or really, really difficult, you'd be going, I can't be bothered, right? There's no point in trying. So there's an element, I guess, of thinking in a game logic of saying, we need to give them some things they can do and where they can show progress. But we also need to give them some targets to stretch towards so that we get progress. And so I guess I hadn't really thought about this, but so you're measuring the tapestry helps you because it gives a broad range of indicators. So you're not focusing just on one thing that might be too easy or too difficult. You're focusing on, but you're thinking behaviorally there, right? And you're going, we need to have a set of metrics that sort of generate the right behaviors in totality. So we need some things that they can do. We also want some things that are a little bit harder for them to do. So there's work, and they can show progress and all these things. And so you're bringing kind of gamification logic into that. It's a little bit like a kind of computer game with different levels. Right, is you're introducing something there that from a behavioral perspective, because if you get the metrics wrong, make them too easy or make them too difficult, people are not going to want to play the game, right? Either it's too easy, job done, I move on, or it's too hard. And so you've got to start factoring this stuff in. And so that also comes into it. I'd never really thought about it in that sense, but you have to kind of keep them in the game to get them to make the changes.
Yeah, 100%. I really like how you describe it. And another thing is not only thinking of the organizations and how to motivate them, but it's also looking into the legitimacy of the measures themselves. This is also an issue with data. How do you get the data to be trusted? How do you get the measures to be trusted and accepted publicly, especially if the data is to be used to show, the organization's performance to the public or to stakeholders? This is also an issue that we need to handle while we develop these measures and manage. So it is complex, but it's also really, really fun.
And I guess as I look at thinking about, I mean, innovation, I think is a really interesting one, which is why I'm focusing on it, because innovation comes with something that governments are often not keen to talk about, which is you need to fail. You need to experiment and try things in order to work out what works. And so if we think, in the commercial field, research and development is well understood. So we spend a certain amount of money on stuff that's not going to work. Advertising, we spend a certain amount of money on stuff that's going to fail. And the tech companies understand this really well. Pivoting is a good example of that. In government, it's much harder to justify failure. If something goes wrong, that's seen as a bad thing, as opposed to a learning opportunity logic. And so what I think is really interesting here is that I guess you also have to think about, if we're going to introduce metrics, we don't want to skew it too much in the way that traditional government metrics might, because traditional government metrics is what have you done? And so we're looking at sort of success. And so implicitly with innovation, like in being innovative, we're going to screw some things up. And there's certain things in government you don't want to screw up, right? We don't want to mess with people's health or whatever. So there's certain context in which we need to be a bit, or road safety, we want to be a bit more careful. But we also, if we want to get this innovative thing, failure is going to be part of it. And so I guess you're also introducing dynamics that might never have previously been just on the radar, right? Things that we don't want to talk about. And so you're having to find metrics for things that have never been measured before. Or if they have, it's been kind of been hidden, right? We don't want to talk about that because that's bad news. So that's quite a challenge, I guess, from a behavioral perspective, is getting people to think about these things, unlocking sources of data that might helpfully tell that story. Because the stories you're talking about telling, I guess this comes back to the original point, from a citizen perspective, we want to know this stuff, right? I want to know how well they are doing. Are they doing a good job? But there's a ton of interest in not disclosing it. And both politicians, I don't want to talk, politicians who fail don't get re-elected. So there's a really interesting thing here. So you're kind of, I guess you have to think about all of these things as you're working out the data, is recognizing, you consult the stakeholders, obviously, because you don't want to impose things on them. But also, I guess you have to think about the stuff they might not want to talk about, the things that are challenging for them.
Yeah, that's why I think for government so far, I think that the motivation to measure comes from the outside and not from the inside. Not internal actors from the government will want to really lead these kind of projects, but mostly external actors like civil society, think tanks, international organizations. The OECD also hired me recently to consult them on developing open government indicators. These are external actors to national governments that are pushing forward these measurement processes. And it is more challenging for an organization to really have the guts to measure themselves, because then they will also always risk to see they're performing lower than they would want to. But it takes courage, and it takes a leader that really wants to improve. Without the data, you can't improve. You need to know where you are, right? So it takes guts to want to measure. I think maybe for companies, for organizations, for corporations, it might be a bit easier. They can keep the results privately and they don't have to publish it if they don't want to, but then they can really use it to guide their decisions. And maybe it's more challenging for public organizations. But yeah, completely agree with you.
And so if we pull all this together, what you're basically doing, if I look at the data and tracking how things are actually working, you're kind of saying the way that we get trust back is that we show that we're focusing on things and we can demonstrate that that's there. And so trust is it's kind of a nebulous thing, right, to a certain extent, because I trust people and things for reasons that are not necessarily, that I either can't explain or that might not even be logical, right? I might sort of trust somebody, I don't know, because ridiculous, right? Because I was at the same university as them or something. I know them. I know that person, and therefore I have a greater degree of trust. Now, the theory would be that I've seen their behaviors over a period of time, or I don't know, if they're like a member of a club I'm a member of, maybe I trust them in principle because they've passed the membership. But it's sort of, we can make logical, but it's kind of, it's an emotional thing, right? It's based on all sorts of heuristics. And so I guess what you're doing is saying here, look, we recognize that unless we make a change, we can't just say to people, trust us, because that's not working. So you're using data to kind of bridge that gap, to say, okay, I'm going to give you some reasons why you should trust what is going on here, because they're being, and I guess part of that includes demonstrating that it's not always successful, right? That we're not having some nonsense narrative, North Korean narrative of everything is always improving. That's what you're doing here, right? Is you're taking those data points. That's how you're bridging that gap between I don't trust you and why should I trust you? Well, the answer is I'm showing you what I'm doing, and we're using a range of different metrics to do that.
Well, I don't completely agree with what you just said. First of all,
Okay.
trust is not just a feeling or a emotion. It especially when it comes to trusting organizations. So maybe trust in people is a bit different, but trust in organization really relies on and comes from how the organization, how the institution is working, comes from their action. So it comes from different things. So we talk about three main pillars. So it comes from their performance, the ability, right? Their ability to deliver on and to achieve their goal comes from its integrity, the organization's integrity, honesty, following rules, and it also comes from its benevolence. So the extent to which we believe the organization cares about me and is similar to me, similar to my values. And measuring organizational's ideals can increase trust. It can increase trust because it reflects that this institution, this government, this organization works with data. So it's professional. It has data. It's consistent. It's scientific. So measuring is already a signal that can increase trust. But it's true that the results of the measurement can decrease trust if especially in the beginning. If we start measuring, we see that the measured organization scores low, that can decrease trust. But it maybe balances out with the courage to measure and rigorousness and the professional act of measuring. Maybe it doesn't, but in the long term, it will improve their performance, and that will increase trust. So if we look at the long-term game, and that's what I think we should, long-term, this will increase trust. And also trust itself is a concept that needs to be measured. And this is the other thing I've been researching for the last 10 years, published on this a lot. How do you even measure trust? That's another ideal. That's another concept that is, maybe you can call it qualitative, but there is a way to measure it. And organizations need to measure. They need to measure the trust of their clients. They need to measure their trust of their investors. Governments need to measure trust of the public. It should be part of their work too.
And I guess when we think about government, it's an interesting thing. I hadn't really reflected on this, but it's kind of like we have to, like, I can choose to change supply. I can do business with other people. I'm a forced user of government services. So in a way, longer term, whether I like it or not, right, wherever I live, I'm subject to whatever that government is. And so that longer term thinking kind of makes sense there because I'm a forced purchaser of their services. And I think this idea of we're shown we're prepared to do this, I think is interesting. And as you were talking, I was reflecting on when we look at when things go wrong, when do things go badly wrong for companies or governments? It tends to be the cover up, right? It's not actually the original screw up. It's when they lie about it or they try and pretend it's, not a big issue when it actually is, or just sort of, sort of not taking the issue seriously, not acknowledging the truth, but when it goes horribly wrong. And so I love this idea that you made around, well, actually, even just the exercise of measuring it, right? Even recognizing that you are willing to confront the truth and that you're not interested in kind of PR statistics. It's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, clearly, if you just sat on bad statistics forever, right, that's not great. But if you're collecting those, then at least that's demonstrating that you are, and genuinely collecting them, doing it sensibly. That act itself sends a signal. I think that's really, really interesting. So test number one is, are you collecting this stuff? Because you can't react to something you haven't got. And then test number two, I guess, over time is once you've demonstrated how are you improving it. But I suppose the fear of, well, if we collect this stuff, we might look really bad. That's exactly your point, isn't it? It's like you have to start there. So there is a period of time where that is a risk. But even in that short period of time, you're just saying, well, we're willing to talk about this, right? We will have those awkward conversations. So I love the signaling effect as much as the actual effect. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and Christian, the goal is not measuring. The goal is improving. What will really improve trust is a trustworthy organization. So the measuring is just the necessary step to really transform governments, organizations to become worthy of trust, right? So really, maybe let's talk more about trust now. You said something that I really agree with, and Luhmann, an important sociologist, spoke about how trust is inherently dependent on choice, and it's relevant only when there is an act of choice. So you said correctly, when we're talking about market, company, um, products, we have a choice. So then trusting the company, trusting the product really, really matters. If I don't trust AI company to treat my data responsibly, I might not use that product, and I would use another one. I have a choice. Then trust really, really matters for those cases. But what happens with governments where I don't have a choice? Like you said correctly, we're a citizen of a country, and the government we have, that's the current government, at least for the next years until next elections. And then what we see, what data shows us, is that we still have a choice whether to cooperate with the government, to comply. I think this is also something you work on a lot, is compliance. And compliance really is dependent on trust. I've seen that in either a command and control compliance, which is more coercive type. Even then, the more we trust the government, the more we trust regulators, the better cooperation would be, the more compliance will be. But especially when we want to move towards more self-regulatory or more voluntary compliance frameworks, then trust is really, really necessary. And I think that's really interesting. That's something we need to talk about more. We need to look at more.
I think it's really interesting that you're bringing quantitative analysis to this, because it does feel like a qualitative thing. Back to, I can't always explain why I trust certain people. And sometimes I get it badly wrong. And you feel let down by something. And that might be a company, that might be an individual. We can't operate without a level of trust, right? So it's not a sort of optional thing. We have to trust other people. Otherwise, we never get anywhere. We can't do anything in the world. And so I love this idea of kind of saying, here's something that instinctively we all understand. And yet we should probably dig into, and you've opened the box really here, right? To say, what does trust actually mean, right? And how can we work out what that's about? Because that's really important.
Yeah, I don't think that quantitative measures are ideal, especially with trust. They uncover part of the truth, and there's definitely a lot of room for a complementary qualitative studies to unveil that. So if we're talking about companies measuring the trust of their clients, yeah, you can run surveys, and you can do them better. So we can talk about that, a whole podcast on how to measure trust. But you should also do interviews and talk to people, and because it is complex. But I do think that without quantitative measures, it remains this trust and other values. They remain these qualitative concepts that we want. We can maybe post on our code of conduct and post it and say these are the values our organizations believe in. Or as the manager, you can say, I aim for trust. And then it just remains that concept that, yeah, everyone agrees with, but you don't really manage, you don't really work with. So I'm not saying that quantitative measures are perfect, but they are the necessary link between just talking about what we want and talking about values and actually changing organizations towards them.
And I love that. I hadn't thought about this before, but I love that idea of organizations saying, we want to be this. And then, or even worse, right? We are this. And you go, well, how do you know? And then the answer would be, right? If you didn't know, the answer, your point would be like, well, just trust us. You just have to trust us. And so that's the thing. You're just going, well, we're going, that's lovely, right? And maybe we can trust you, but we don't know that.
Yeah.
And so we want to make sure that, so implicitly somewhere we want some reassurance that trust is well placed.
Yeah.
That we can trust what you say, that you say what you mean, right? And that you behave in the manner. I mean, it comes back, there's that great phrase, trust but verify.
Yeah.
Right, which is kind of what you're pointing towards, right? Which is the start point is we have to trust people, but actually, wouldn't it be better if we had something to back that up? Some kind of evidence. And even if we don't need the evidence, you're saying if the other person has shown they are willing to gather evidence of their own trustworthiness, then that's a great way of signaling trust.
Yeah. We know that PR is not enough to fix trust issues. We know that from many research. I also did one testing whether communicating different trustworthiness aspects of the EU can change people's perspectives on the EU. And it can't. It can't. It's not enough just to communicate, just to say we are trustworthy. People look at organizations, look at how they behave, how they perform. They look at different aspects. They look at their performance, but they also look at moral values, at their transparency, their participation. They look at the integrity, and then trust is built based on actions. And that's why it's not enough to look at to have marketing department deal with this concept of trust. It's not just a communicative um, con- concept.
It strikes me that actually, if your approach to these things is just to talk about how good you are, then actually it can work on some level. It can have some effect, but beyond a certain point, it can actually let you down. Because I always talk a lot about induction training when you join a big organization and you're there on the first day. And they say they spend the whole of induction training is often telling you things that you're not thinking, you're not worried about, right? What you care about when you join a company is like, where's the coffee machine? When am I going to get my passport back? Is this a good bunch of people? Like, is the food any good? What's the gym like? What time can I leave? Right, have I made a mistake? Those sorts of questions. And what you get fed with is a whole load of diet of kind of corporate propaganda, which is things like videos of the chief exec going, "We are a very ethical company." And I always think it's funny because you sort of think, I don't think anybody sitting in that room watching this video, it normally is a video, right, is thinking, I wonder whether they're an ethical company. And so you almost sow more suspicion by saying it, because I'm going to judge for myself. And actually, if you have made a big thing about how ethical a company you are, and I leave the induction training and I go and discover very quickly that everybody around me is behaving in an unethical manner, then not only has that video not done anything in terms of convincing you, it's the opposite, right? Because what it's done is it's made me think, oh, they're liars, right? Because I can see the reality versus what they've said, and they've tried to mislead me. And so I think this interesting thing about PR is viewed as a positive, right? It's probably how do we manage our image? And of course, you need people keeping an eye on what your image is. And there is a certain extent if you want to make sure you're projecting it in the right way. But if you look like you are lying, you can make things worse. If you don't have any good PR, it's going to be bad. People get a bad impression of you, bad impression. But equally, if your PR is misaligned with reality, they can actually make it worse. And so I love this idea of recognizing that actually it's not just a case of spinning your way out of trouble. You have to look at the substance of it as well.
Yeah, 100%. It's like greenwashing, right? It's it's a PR act that creates damages to organizations. We really want to see that the PR is aligned with the actions, and then that's powerful. I completely agree with what you said.
You kind of know what good looks like, right? Because you've been working on that. But how do you feel as an individual with things you're not involved with?
Well, I think that what you're talking about is whether citizens even know and are aware of governmental work. And there is a gap there. And I'm probably in some sort of bubble because I'm really working with governments and I know it doesn't reflect general population. But people still do take cues from the little they see from a news article about a ministry, something that happened. They see the result, right? They get service from the government and they create from all these cues, they create this construct of what they think, how they think government is, and whether they think this government deserves their trust. When you ask people if they trust the government, they will have an answer. If you ask people what they think about the government, they will have an answer. So people, even if they are not very familiar with all the the background and the backstage of how things actually work and whether a ministry has an innovator officer or not, they still see the result. They see things and they create their trust based on that. So people trust, and even if they're not very, very familiar. And so then, yes, if you are an organization that does beautiful things, you want to get people to know that. So you need PR then. You need to communicate more. I also think that participation, not only communicating and being transparent is important, but also involving citizens in the activity of government, in the decision-making is key. It increases trust and it also increases the legitimacy and the democraticness of action. So involving citizens more in public policy is important and should be done more. But also, if we're talking about citizens, there's something else that I think is really interesting that we found out recently. And really, this is a puzzle I still don't have an answer for. I'm interested to hear what you think about it. And what we see is that people are not all the same. So people give different weight or different importance to different values. So while overall we know that performance, integrity, benevolence is important. The importance that we give for each of these three pillars are different. We see, for example, that more conservative people give less importance to integrity and to moral, and more importance to performance. And this is a puzzle because once you understand that not everyone is the same and not everyone will trust your organization based on the same criteria, then this introduces this complexity that I still don't really know how to solve. So maybe just saying, so just make sure you're capable and honest, right? You have all, and then you tick all the checkbox, and then you're covered. But maybe more complex than that. Like, how can should we treat our customers, our clients, our citizens, should we trust them differently based on their ideology?
The thing I find fascinating about this is, on the one hand, if you look at I don't know, manufacturers of consumer products, they've always known that there are certain products that certain people want, right? It's a silly example, right? You're only going to buy pet food if you have a pet. There's no point in buying dog food if you don't own a dog. So there's products that we target specific people that some people will buy that other people won't. And then if we look at a product that we all need, I don't know, toothpaste, for example, we will all have our preferred brands of it. So they've kind of known about this, and they've been segmenting the world, and they try, consumer product, they try and cater for the broadest possible audience. But there are products out there that just cater for certain people, and they're not bought by everybody. So they've kind of understood that not everybody is the same. And so I think it's really interesting with politics, where I guess they used to sort of, take different sort of demographics of people and try and kind of codify and say this type of voter. And what we've started to see now as data's got more sophisticated is we start to recognize that actually, just because somebody is a particular age or a particular social demographic or does a particular job doesn't necessarily mean that they will match with all of those other people. And through digital technology, we can start to target these people directly. And so I think it's a challenge that consumer products are slightly further ahead on. And I think the electoral systems, if we look at sort of first past the post electoral systems, they're not designed for that kind of plurality. So the machinery of government relies on the presumptions that you've talked about. And yet, when we look at the kind of commercial reality, and I guess this is the difference between governments where you've got that long-term stability, we tend not to change electoral systems that often, right? We keep them solid with longer-term thinking, and yet the rest of the world has kind of moved on. And so I think what you're talking about in the trust context sort of reflects a broader challenge about how the world is moving and that government has to catch up. And I think one of the reasons they're not, back to the trust point, one of the reasons they're not trusted is they look like they're kind of analog structures in a digital world. And so they're not responding in that way. And so I think the question I would have, I guess, is that whether those structures survive, because they're so at odds with everything else, right? They haven't moved in the same way these other things are. And so the trust thing, I wonder whether the challenge is, it's not just about the metrics that you're talking about. We probably need structures that adapt, because they're always going to be out of sync with everything else. Does that make sense?
It definitely does. I think that, though, that governments work on a different logic than companies. They have to care about equality, and something about segmenting the population and treating it differently causes some trouble there. But still, governments should and can learn a lot from marketing. For example, project I was involved in and was published 2 months ago, the Bank of Israel, the central bank, is considering digital currency, CBDC. And I really pushed for asking, doing a market research, what is maybe very clear for any company, to talk to people, to ask about the preferred design, run some A/B testing, UX design. But basically, all of these things it's taking the client's perspective into account when designing your product. These are things that governments don't do, and they really understand. This is actually a case of success, because the central bank really understood that this is important, and they actually did run a survey. I led that, and we not only looked into trust and what will make citizens trust this potential tool more or less. We also looked into different possible designs and features and asked and saw what would make people more interested in that tool. So whether or not they would eventually introduce this currency, that's a different topic. They're still considering. But this is an example of how a governmental organization, a public body, can use these tools, these marketing tools, right? These advanced surveys methods that allow them to listen to the public, listen to their potential user, the client, and design and have the findings affect their design decisions. And I would really want to see more of that. And so I agree with what you said there. The government is behind in many aspects. I think this logic of seeing the citizen as a client, asking for their perspective and then adapting to their perspective is something that is very democratic in its sense, and it's not been done enough.
That's really easy to say, but when you've got structures and processes that are not built on that basis, it's quite a big challenge to shift. And it comes back to the earlier conversation we were having about vested interests. Is you can sort of see why, if you are somebody that's been in the government for many years, your willingness to try new things is going to be quite challenged. And I think what you're pointing towards here, it's partly scrutiny and asking good questions, but it's also thinking about, I guess, modernization. And I think one of the challenges that we have with government is that often, you get people that have been in government for a long time, and there isn't often that kind of flow through that there is in the private sector, where people should move between companies. In and out of government, it can happen at very, very senior levels. I mean, I'm not going to say it doesn't happen, but it's a rarity. And so some of this modern thinking, I guess, particularly where it challenges orthodoxy, in some ways we shouldn't be surprised. Right? The obstacle with these things is often human.
Yeah. And I also think that there are some really undemocratic or non-democratic perspectives in current democracies. So, elected politicians that when you ask them about public opinion, they see it as a non-stable, non-reliable thing. We shouldn't listen to the public. They don't really know. They're an unrational actor. And we see that in different ways. So in financial regulators, for example, it's very common to perceive the public as uneducated and just not the relevant audience to ask about. Like when we design a financial tool, we should it should be within our economical circle of academics, and that's it. So that's why I was really happy and surprised by that example of a central bank that really finally introduces the public, the non-financial circle. And for me, that's true democracy. That's the essence of democracy, not just election. Democracy is having the people be part of decision making, be part of policy making. So excluding them from decision making, not asking their opinion, not educating them enough to be able to take part of the conversation, that's something that creates distrust. I think that is what, I mentioned my youth and what troubled me, and when I saw these groups of people that felt alienated and didn't trust the systems, they felt disconnected. And I think these types of projects, these types of surveys where organizations, systems stop, they don't start designing their policies and go ahead just within with their political and academic circle, but they open up to the public, to different types of citizens, and that will not only improve trust, but also improve the result and make it more efficient. The main reason that the central bank wanted to do this survey was because they wanted the eventual tool to be adopted. Their interest was to have an effective policy. So they understood that to be effective, to get citizens to comply, to get citizens to use your products, you need to ask them. It's not just for trust. So trust and effectiveness go hand in hand, and I think this is the idea I really want to emphasize, is that it's not, you don't need to choose between being moral and ethical and being effective and performance and achieve your goals. And I feel like for many it's either or. You need I focus on performance. I don't care about that transparency. That doesn't matter. What matters is performance. And I think that it's wrong. I think that in many cases, it improves performance. It improves results. To be more trustworthy, to be more ethical. These things go hand in hand more than when we than we usually think of.
As you were talking, I was thinking about a classic example that proves your point about involving people is jury service, right? So we ask members of the public to go sit and to judge whether their fellow citizens have committed a crime. Right? That's a perfectly normal process. Now, what we don't go is, well, what does the general public know about? They don't understand the detail of this, right? We should leave this in the hands of judges and lawyers. We want the opinion of the general public. We want average citizens to come in who are not tainted by legal process, but can just make their own minds up around things. But we do want consistency in government in terms of judgments and sentences. And that's why we leave sentencing to judges and we leave the decision of the guilty up to the, or not guilty up to the jury. And so there's a really good illustration of we're totally cool with that, right? If you said in countries where they have jury service, well, we're going to get rid of jury service, people would be going, that's outrageous, right? We're removing this thing. And yet it's exactly what you're talking about. It's almost the beauty of it is they're not experts. And that's the really interesting thing for me. There is a presumption that you need to be an expert to be able to make decisions. And of course, that's true on some level, right? There are certain things that are very, very complicated and that sort of just having people who know nothing coming in there but I think that's a good illustration of the point that this is not a new way of thinking. This has always been there, that bringing people into that space who don't necessarily have the expertise, but bring something else.
Yeah, it's a great example, and you're completely right.
It's the only one I can think of, by the way, but
The thing is that, of course, we need professional decision making, and that's true for companies, and it's true for governments. We need professional, autonomous civil service, but we also won't see it as legitimate, right? We call it technocratic if there is no elected politician controlling it or leading the direction. So it's all about the balance between the elected and the civil society, and introducing the public, like the third part of this triangle, I think completes it. So it's also shouldn't be left, public policy shouldn't be left just between politicians and civil servants. The public should be more involved in it. That's basically what I'm saying. So it's not replacing professional decision making or political. It's adding to it. It's just complementing it.
And how do we balance all of this? If I look at the world that's feels like it's becoming more dangerous, right? Lots of sort of extreme politicians all over the place. And so you could say, well, one of the reasons that democracy is dangerous in the way that you're talking about it is it makes countries vulnerable, right? We can influence the electorate to do things. And so there is a risk associated with too much kind of more open government, if you like, because it makes it vulnerable to, we've seen examples of, let's pick an example, the UK, right? The Brexit vote to leave the EU. There is a lot of evidence that there was manipulation of people through social media. Right? And I'm not going to get into whether that would have changed the overall outcome, but clearly there was so you could sort of point and say, I'm assuming your response to to that is to say, well, we need to build defenses against those sorts of things, but we have to be thinking longer term. And if we need governments to do things where they can't go, because there are certain decisions the governments have to make in the spur of the moment, right? You can't go to ask the general public about their views on there might be some defense operation that you need to conduct, or there might be some other emergency that you need to deal with where you just need to. And I guess your point would be, we need to trust that they're going to do the right thing, right? Because they can't consult on everything. There is a degree of trust that we need. And the way that we get the trust is through the mechanisms you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, you brought up Brexit, and this brings us to talk about polarization and how do these ideas test in light of polarization. I think polarization makes things more complex, and but also really highlights how trust. So what happens when you neglect this issue of trust and you let it just deteriorate, and trust in government becomes so low that the discourse is non-stable, and then extreme decisions are made. So I take from it as an example of how you should really make sure trust in governments is maintained, and fix it before it becomes too late. Listen to all voices. Don't neglect it. I mean, this is from both political sides. Yeah, there is a distrust of the other side, and this also creates huge issues, right? Societal distrust reflects into politics. So it's really an extreme case that And these cases are coming up more and more. The more, like, as we speak, right? There's more and more extremism and polarization, and this really makes it eminent how we have to deal with the trust issue.
And as we look forward, I think implicit in your work, and this is why I love talking to you, is there's a real sense of optimism here. You're doing what you do because you believe that we can do a better job. You're tackling a really big challenge, right? The way we talk about this, the dynamics we're talking about, this is not easy. And just you have to deal with the orthodoxy, but it's also a practical challenge of how do we gather the data, collect it, analyze it. So this is difficult. None of this is easy. But you're clearly driven by a belief in that this is important. And so your business is very, very, I'm guessing, intrinsically motivated. You're fascinated by the topic and you're like, how can I bring my research and thinking to bear in this space?
Yeah. Sometimes when I tell people what I do and I tell them, for example, I measure government on their efficiency, people just laugh. Like,
Sure.
what? That's like, I know the result. It's zero. Or, and then like, yeah, we don't need to measure that. I can do your job. It's just zero. So, yeah, that's the common response I get. And I feel sometimes like a fool, like a naive fool. But I feel like it's what keeps me going. I'm born optimist. I'm always the most optimist person in the group. So I can't control it. But I also need it to have hope. I think lots of us are very hopeless now. Like if we just focus on distrust and on, negative things and how bad things are going, it's really a bad place to be in emotionally, and it's not constructive. So I think personally, my strategy is to focus on what I can. And I think that and it's also very aspiring. My work is really aspiring because when I think of ideals, when I meet people that they share this goal with me, it's really gives me hope, working with people that want to transform their organizations and because they care about it, they want it. It really brings back hope, in humanity and in the future. So my work really aspires me, and it's not for this type of work is not for people that need immediate results, because as I said, sometimes what we do actually creates the opposite. You have to look at the long term. You have to think strategically and believe this is going to make a change in the long term. So in the long term, measuring this, focusing on these values will improve them, hoping that it will, and really just working with other people that believe in the same ideals and want to act upon it. It's really aspiring. So yeah, I love what I do.
I think there's something really addictive about talking to people that think in those terms. And it is idealistic and challenging and there's all sorts of practical reasons why we shouldn't do it. But I love that. And so I want to say, just keep going, because I think we need people like you to be questioning these things. And what I love is you're questioning in a really constructive way. Is you're not going, this is terrible, right? There is a solution there. There is a way of looking at the world that is designed to improve things, designed to make things better. And so that comes across in the way you talk. So I just want to say to you, just keep going, because the passion and enthusiasm, it's not naturally a subject. To your point, right? People go, oh, well, I can tell you what, don't bother. It's almost like don't bother with that, right? It's just too difficult. And you've just gone, I'm going to open that box.
Thanks so much, Christian. I really appreciate your words. And I really enjoy talking to you. And I feel like you understand that because you're probably the same. And you're probably optimistic too. So you get me.
Or naive, but I kind of think, who cares, right? Let's find out. So if people want to find out more about what you're doing, how do they do that?
Yeah. So first of all, you can follow me on LinkedIn, Libby Maman, or my company, Luminata. And yeah, I would love to connect to other naive dreamers, visionaries that believe they can change the world. Those are my people, and I would really, really love to meet you and talk to anyone that is interested in this type of work.
Amazing. And I want to say thank you to Professor Yuval Feldman, who's the reason that we connected. He's a long-term friend of the show. He was the very first episode. So if people have found what you're talking about interesting, his work plays into this as well. He's coming back on the show very soon to talk about his latest research. So I'll put links to not only Yuval's episodes where he's come on the show, but also some of the topics that we've discussed. So people can find those in the show notes. So please keep doing what you're doing. But in the meantime, thank you for being a fabulous guest on the show.
Thank you so much.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to you, of course, for listening, and to Libby for appearing. To find out more about Libby, her research, and the work she's doing, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, where have you been? But thank you so much for finding us. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms and also on YouTube. If you like what you've heard, please do leave a review. It helps others to discover the show and helps me to continue to bring you conversations like this one. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, and we're into the 300s now, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay safe. If you're part of an organisation that claims to be trustworthy, why not ask the question, what evidence are we giving people so they can actually believe that? But above all, thank you so much for listening.